Thank you very much. I'm extremely grateful for the invitation to come and speak to you today. And I'm very conscious, having listened to the lectures this morning, which were, by the way, incredibly stimulating, all of them, that I'm a little bit off centre from the rest. I think I would describe myself as a glass half full. So the tenor of my talk is going to be quite different, I suspect, from what you've been hearing and what you're going to be hearing later. So my basic starting point is a recognition that democracy is being challenged. But it's being challenged. That doesn't necessarily mean it's doomed. So that's the message I want to put across to you. And I think the way I'll start is by referring to a book. I'm an academic, so I have to do that. An absolutely brilliant book, Ruling the Void, published by the late Peter Mayer, an Irish political scientist who died rather tragically just before the book was published. A very influential study and an easy read, a page turner by political science standards. And Peter is talking about democracy being doomed. That's its message. You can see the lone parliamentarian sitting in an empty parliament. That's the theme he's trying to give you. So he talks in terms of a withdrawal from representative democracy, both by citizens and by politicians. And a lot of the kind of evidence that he uses to develop his argument is quite familiar to, I suspect, most of us, and we've heard a lot about it already today. So a citizen withdrawal, he says, is declining turnout. It's growing volatility. Voters are changing their votes more and more. They're going between different parties. It's the rise of extreme parties. They're the sort of main indicators of a withdrawal from the representative process by the citizenry, particularly the decline in turnout. And then he talks in terms of politician withdrawal, and the sort of indicators that he uses is that essentially the political parties and the politicians in those parties are drifting away from their societal links. We heard a bit about that this morning, and are becoming much more encased in the state, much more reliant on the state. A good indicator of that is the reliance of political parties on state funding. I think Norway, like all the other parties, the Norwegian parties, over 60% of their funding comes from the state. That's a common pattern across Western Europe to this day. So that would be an example of what Peter Mayer talks about as politician withdrawal. And from all of this, he paints a very depressing picture. Effectively, as he puts it, democracy in its death throes. We're doomed. We're in a very serious state. The sort of message that we've heard already in some of the presentations, at least today. And he's not the only one saying this, but he's a very influential figure as somebody in the past who was very positive about the state of political parties and democracy. It says something when Peter Mayer is starting to talk about the dangers to democracy. But the question I want to address before I get to the Irish case is he entirely right to be so pessimistic? Is democracy doomed? That's the question I want to put to you. And while I was listening today, I decided to, I'm using an old version of the slide, I think. That's a pity. I had a slide there, but I'll tell you what the slide was, which was a picture of a graph of levels of satisfaction with democracy in the 9 EU member states since the 1970s. And the graph is going upwards. So levels of satisfaction is actually going ever so slightly upwards since the 1970s. So we have an issue here. We have evidence that isn't necessarily supporting the popular debate. That maybe things are bad, but are they as bad as the popular debate, as the media debate is suggesting it is? And so I want to make 2 points about this. I want to first of all ask the question, was democracy in the past really quite so fantastic? So here we have, I'm told by Google, this is a picture of your parliament in the 1960s or thereabouts. It's the best I could get. And when I looked at it in a bigger profile, it looked pretty male, pale and stale to me. That it was a parliament like everywhere else in Europe, like all established democracies at its time in the 1960s, that was predominantly male-oriented, full of male members. And look at the situation today. Today, across the Nordic countries, 42% of MPs are women. The Nordic countries are off the scale. As I'm sure you know, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark are the examples that the rest of us are aspiring to in terms of the representation of women. You have, in some cases, over 50% I think in Sweden, certainly you have over 40% in all of those cases. At the time that picture was taken, the average representation of women in the Nordic states was 12%. So you've gone a long way since then. So a very male-dominated system way back in the golden age of democracy, which is now beginning to finally dissipate. And then let me use some examples from my own country. I'm sure we could find examples from many other countries if I want to develop this point about whether democracy really was so brilliant in the past. Eamon de Valera, the founding father of our system and longtime Prime Minister of our country, kissing the ring of the Archbishop of Dublin. The deference, the due deference to the clergy was a very prominent feature of the Ireland that I grew up in. So when I was a student in the 1970s and 1980s, you couldn't buy contraceptives. You couldn't get divorced. If you were gay, it was illegal. It was a crime. That was as recently as 25 years ago. So we've gone quite a long way since then in terms of the reduction of the power of the clergy over us. And one other picture, the Magdalen laundries. I don't know if you've come across these stories. Not unique to Ireland, but these were still in existence in the 1990s. So, in case you weren't aware of the story, these were laundries that were set up to look after fallen women who had the temerity to become pregnant outside of marriage, who became slave labourers for the convents, making sure that they washed the clothes for the citizens of Ireland, and they were effectively locked up. That was the golden age of democracy. So that would be my first point. To what extent are we talking about... Oh, there's my graph. I put it in the wrong place. There you go. You can see it's going up. That would be my first point about whether the golden age of democracy really was quite as golden as we like to think. Was it really that much better than the democracy of today? That's one point. The second point I want to make is, are we looking at moments of crisis, or are we looking at moments of change? Because what I would be suggesting to you is we're seeing actually change rather than crisis. Change in two respects. One other book, I think it's the last book I'm going to show you. Russell Dalton, it's the best picture I could get, not very good, I know. A book called The Good Citizen, and another page-turner, another book well worth reading. And Russ is developing an argument that he's not alone in making this argument, that there's a new kind of citizenship emerging. Citizens are changing, and how citizens relate to democracy is also changing. Citizens are changing by becoming less deferential and more individualized. So less deferential in the sense that they are more critical. Citizens are more critical, they're more demanding, particularly younger citizens, which is the focus of Russ Dalton's book there as The Good Citizen. They're more demanding, they're looking beyond elections. They're looking to other forms of political participation beyond the election moment, in between the election moment. They want to engage with politics in a different way to just simply the passive act of voting every 3, 4, or 5 years, depending on how often your elections are. So they're less deferential, and they're more individualized. The more individualized, so that means they're less clubbable. So this is why you see declining party membership. But it's not just the political parties that are losing members. You know, the Bird Society is losing members. The local bowling club is losing members. You're seeing more individualization in terms of how we as individual citizens engage with our social activities, perhaps through the internet, perhaps through more informal NGO links, but not through joining clubs and being active in clubs. So citizens are changing. And in that context, you would understand, therefore, if you accept that kind of argument, why turnout would be going down. Because elections are less and less important to the more engaged citizenry. They're looking at other things than elections to engage in the political process. And that's also why you might see greater voter volatility. Because they're thinking before they vote. Those who do bother to vote, they're not always voting the way their mother or father would have voted. They're voting on the basis of the parties that have the most attractive policies, perhaps. So that's the first area in which democracy is changing. And the second area in which democracy is changing is in terms of the fact that it's reforming. Democracy doesn't stand still. Here's just one table which I think sums it up really quite well. This is over a 30-year period in all of Europe's established democracies. This was an analysis done by these colleagues at the European University Institute. That's a lot of reform. That's a lot of reform. That's over a 30-year period. It's quite a lot of change in how democracy operates. You know, more direct election, more direct democracy, which is the possibility for citizens to petition for referendums, for example. Decentralization, when you decentralize, you bring in more elections, because now you're electing regional bodies, for example, so you're electing more things than you would have elected in the past. So democracies are changing, but it's not just that they're changing. What has been noted is that they're changing in a certain direction. So, this was the way we were all brought up, or at least my generation was brought up, to understand what democracy was. This was the original origins of democracy, Robert Dahl's polyarchy for the political scientists in the room. The notion that I, as a citizen, would be called to vote, I would be able to vote, I would have suffrage extended to me as a citizen in a democracy to be allowed to vote, and I would be given choice as to who I vote for. So political parties who want to put up candidates would be allowed to vote for them. So that is the basic generic definition of what a democracy is in the original version of democracy. I know there was more to it, but that was the basis of it. Well, there's now a number of colleagues who are saying that maybe what we've been going through is a second wave of democratic transformation. And just look at the sort of patterns that this column is now summarizing for you. There's a certain feature that they all share in common, at least I would say, which is that they are engaging with citizens. They are allowing citizens into the room. So citizens can elect more offices than they used to elect. Citizens can call for referendums in some countries now, when they weren't able to do in the past. Citizens who do still bother to be in political parties can pick the candidates. In the past, it was done by activists, not by all the members. Citizens have much more information, so the Magdalene Laundry scenario would be far more difficult to apply in an age of freedom of information. That's a huge change. And it's this last one that I want to spend my remaining time talking about. It's citizen inclusion in policy and institutional debates. And I suspect David, who follows me, will also be talking about his experiences in Belgium with the G1000. That's a really good example of how the citizens can be brought in to engage in the process of discussing reform and discussing change. So that's what I want to spend the rest of my time focusing on. I want to look at that, and I think I'm okay for time for now, am I?
You have about 12 minutes.
Grand, that'll do me.
Will that be all right?
That'll be fine, thank you very much. I want to talk about how citizens can be included in the reform agenda. So I'm talking about a particular way in which you engage the citizens. And the phrase that's often referred to is sortition. I think David will be talking about that, and I know David stresses it in his recent best-selling book. Citizen members are selected randomly. They're not elected, they're selected. It's like jury duty. An opinion poll company picks your name at random in a lottery, and somebody knocks on your door and says, you are a member of this assembly. A very different way of selecting your citizens. A convention that's given a very clearly defined agenda. It's set up for a purpose or a set of purposes, but its time is delimited. Once it's done its job, it ceases to exist. So you're not creating a whole new stream of politicians here. It's got a particular kind of role. An important role for experts. Experts have a role, but they are witnesses. They are not members of this entity. And the way it operates is deliberation. And deliberation is a very different way of operating to parliamentary procedures, where you've got the two sides of the House represented and people are standing up and speaking on behalf of their party and trying to score points off the other. Deliberation is facilitated discussion in small groups where everyone has an equal voice and everyone gets a chance to speak. So we're talking about a very different kind of constitutional convention to the sort of conventions that have been the norm up till now. So this is a typology. We love them in political science. But basically, I want to show you the sort of two common ways in which conventions can operate. So the Icelandic Constitutional Council of a few years ago, where its members were elected, they ran for office, they had mandates, they were elected members, the 25 or whatever number was in the end. And at the end of their deliberations, there was a popular vote on the outcome. Or the proposed UK Constitutional Convention that many of the NGOs in Britain are clamouring for now after the Scottish referendum. Well, what I want to spend my remaining 8 minutes talking about is Ireland's Constitutional Convention, where deliberation was the feature. So the members were not elected, the members were selected randomly. This is the defining feature of it. And Ireland is not the first to do this. So there were 3 cases before which Ireland's was very closely modelled on and deliberately modelled on, which were the citizens' assemblies in Canada and the Netherlands, British Columbia, Ontario, and the Netherlands in the early part of the millennium. Random selections of citizens brought together to discuss electoral reform, a major constitutional change. So Ireland was sort of modelled on that, but it had some important differences. Here's the website for the Irish Constitutional Convention. Not the most user-friendly website, but if you can manage to get your way through it, you can see there's a YouTube page where you can see a lot of the coverage of the main debates and everything, and get a flavour for the convention, whose work only finished a few months ago. So we're still waiting to see the full outcome of the convention. So this was what it comprised. 100 members, 66 citizens randomly selected. I stress that. Somebody knocked on the door of one of those 66 and said, you are the person. They weren't obliged to accept, so if they didn't accept, the opinion poll company had to go 10 doors down and pick the next door and knock on their door. That was the basic methodology of random selection, although you had to have reasonable quotas, so there was 50-50 men, women, for example. And then 33 members of the parliament, and then a chair to run the whole thing. And as you can see, the members, because they were selected, not elected, didn't feel they had a mandate. Very different from Iceland, where the members felt they had a mandate because they were elected into office. And the politicians, as I said, were in the room as fellow members. Here's a picture of one of the meetings of the convention. So you can see the way it was set up. There's a facilitator, there's a note taker, and you're mixing the politicians. They're sitting literally cheek by jowl next to an ordinary citizen. And by the end of 14 months of meetings, these guys had struck up huge friendships. So our team have interviewed the politician members and the citizen members, and the sense of regard that one side has for the other is hugely improved, just by virtue of the experience of being involved in this important process. Here's its agenda, kind of a quirky agenda, but that's politics, isn't it? So the two coalition parties that formed the government and set up the Constitutional Convention couldn't agree on a number of issues, so they said, right, we'll give it to this Constitutional Convention to discuss. So some quite important topics in there. Same-sex marriage would be the most obvious one, but some also pretty ridiculously stupid little points like whether our presidency should be a 5-year or 7-year term. Our president has no powers whatsoever, so who gives a damn how long he or she is elected into office? But anyway, that was one of the topics they got to discuss. And they were able to add to their list, so they brought on 2 more topics, 2 very meaty topics there. So this process went on for 14 months, meeting roughly once a month for a weekend, with expert witnesses brought in to give their expert advice, documents circulated in advance so they could do their homework, and then experts taking questions from the citizens, but then leaving the stage. So it was the citizen and politician members of the convention together who then deliberated and made recommendations, and those recommendations have gone back to government. And so far, because we're still going through the process of the government deciding on the recommendations, so far we're promised 3 referendums. These are the 2 big ones. There's a third very technical one. So next year we'll be voting in Ireland on same-sex marriage and on reducing the voting age to 16. And there are expectations that at least 3 other referendums are also likely to be promised in the very near future. So we've yet to actually see the outcome of this in terms of whether the votes pass. But if you held a gun to my head and said, could you predict the results of any of them, I would say that the same-sex marriage one has a very good chance of passing. And that referendum vote would not have happened if we didn't have the Irish Constitutional Convention. So my last slide is simply to finish where I started from, to recognise that democracies are being challenged, but perhaps they are starting to rise to the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David.